The city smelled of rain and expensive incense the morning Nin tied the silk sash of her wedding dress. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glass towers blurred into a silver wash. Below, the service vans and wedding florists moved like careful, silent sharks. Nin's hand closed on the small, cold circle of her mother's ring, an old thing that had survived a dozen family quarrels and one war of wills. And for a moment, everything in the room narrowed to that metal on her finger and the steady, impossible beating of her heart. If you're watching this on the channel, stay with us until the end. Subscribe, hit the bell, and like if you want more stories like this. Content warning: this episode contains themes of emotional abuse, suicidal ideation, miscarriage, and institutionalization. Please seek support if these topics affect you. Outside the chapel doors, the staff moved like a well-drilled crew on the deck of some luxury liner. Ushers straightening programs, a florist coaxing a last bloom into place. Inside, Pessy waited by the altar, a man shaped by restrained force and rare laughter. His suit immaculate, his wrist heavy with the watch that read like a small, private promise of authority. He looked at Nin the same way men sometimes looked at fragile, dangerous things they intended to protect, with fierce calculation and something like tenderness. Then the glass doors swung open, and Linchan stood on the threshold. He did not look like a man transformed by regret, so much as a man caught in the act of facing his own miscalculation. His coat was wet at the shoulders, a smear of mud marred a polished shoe. For a breath, the world narrowed further. The hum of the orchestra fell away, the bridesmaids' laughter thinned, and Nin felt the old familiar thud beneath her ribs. Fear, braided with a slow, stubborn steadiness she had been training for since his absence. Nin. His voice was small in that enormous place. It carried everything he had left unsaid for years, apologies unpracticed, secrets packed tight, the peculiar ache of someone who realized too late that he had lost not only a person, but a life he had built on other people's lies. "You should have called," she said. The sentence was short as a sliver. It landed between them and refused to bend. Linchan's mouth opened and closed. The rows between them seemed to lengthen, full of witnesses who had come expecting a spectacle of triumph and instead found the raw, old weather of private history. Pessy's hand tightened around Nin's fingers, not possessive but protective, and the crowd shivered like a body catching a chill. "You left me for her," Nin said, and the name that could have made a child of her was not spoken aloud: Shinjawi. He hated her then. He had wanted her. He had built his betrayal into a new life. A mahjong flashed behind Nin's eyes, the porridge in her mother's kitchen, steam like a small white flag. The way his fist had once struck the table in anger when she had refused to move to the shadow of his ambitions. The old hurt rose like a tide. "I never stopped," Linchan started, but he did not finish. He had no map for this room, for this altar, for the idea that Nin could stand here under chandeliers and not be the woman who waited to be rescued. He had expected maybe tears, a throwback to the small, pliant Nin he had once controlled. Instead, he found a woman who had learned to measure herself by something else. Pessy did not speak. His eyes were blue poured cold, and when he looked at Linchan, there was no private cruelty, only the neutral interest of someone cataloging the past's relevance to his present. The orchestra resumed like a recovered conversation. Nin breathed. The silk seemed less heavy than several years ago, when every binding felt like a rope. She walked forward, each step a small, deliberate defiance, until she stood opposite the man who had left her for the brightness of another woman's perfume and the promise of faster money. A week earlier, the board of the company she had rebuilt, Nin Solutions, had sent her a congratulatory note and a private investor's letter that doubled the company's valuation overnight. She had not planned to marry a billionaire that day. She had planned, instead, to sign a contract that would keep her employees' jobs, to look the future in the face and tell it she would not be silent. But life is a patient author. It will place the scene you need on top of the scene you arrange. "Why are you here?" Nin asked when the officiant's voice dropped to a hush. There were cameras, not the flashy kind of social media clips, but small corporate press teams and photographers who chronicled mergers and marriages in equal measure. Someone somewhere would later call it a publicity moment. Nin felt no inclination to give them the satisfaction. Lynch's answer was a whisper that nonetheless found its way to the steps where their past sat like an uninvited guest. He swallowed. I saw your name in the paper. I heard about the acquisition. I heard Pessy's name. I thought maybe I could explain." He had not been able to ask for her forgiveness the year he vanished. He had faked heartache, staged small tragedies, slipped through legal loopholes with forged documents, and a funeral paid for by someone who wanted to see him presumed dead. He had crossed borders and played at different names until the taste of forgetting sat soggy under his teeth. Shinjawi had been the bright, sharp thing he used to cut the past into pieces. She had wanted power in the same way some people wanted oxygen. "You explain by standing in my wedding?" Nin said. Her voice did not shake. It had the flatness of someone who had learned to inventory pain without letting it swallow them. "You explain by interhumping a promise I asked no one to make me undo?" On the other side of the aisle, the mellowness in Pacey's jaw gave way to a small, almost invisible crick, one more movement catalogued by men who learned to read faces like contracts. He had built a life from quiet rules. He was used to people who arrived with whole suitcases of complication. But this man, this Lynchian, looked like the type who expected doors to open for him because he had learned to convince others he deserved it. "You don't get a say," Pacey said finally, his voice low and even. It was not a threat. It was the law of the present, pronounced. The hush that followed had nothing to do with music. It was the city holding its breath, the present testing whether the past could still find a foothold. In the weeks that followed, the footage of that morning would run in small loops across the business channels. Pundits would speculate about drama. Gossip would suggest Lynchian had staged a last-minute melodrama to gain something. Influence, a legacy, perhaps a request for custody that would turn cruel under the right lawyer's pen. But the cameras could not see behind Nin's eyes. The memory of a night 5 years earlier when she had opened her mouth and swallowed a fistful of pills. The taste of metal and the quiet of the apartment where the phone had not rung. She had been found by a neighbor who had smelled smoke, someone panicking and leaving a pot on the stove, and had been taken to a hospital where fluorescent lights felt like interrogation. They had said later she had been lucky. Later she would interpret it as the precise, ugly grace of being spared. Nin had been hospitalized for a week. The diagnosis that followed took the shape of professional words: clinical depression, adjustment disorder, and then the harder work of therapy, of finding doctors who would see her as a woman and not a spectacle. She could trace the line from that bed to the boardroom where she now sat at the head of a table and signed contracts with a signature that had once trembled. Lynch's presence at the wedding was not an isolated mistake. He had drifted back into the city 6 months earlier, thin at the edges and with a new name on his tongue. He had hoped for an easy gate, apologies, a story of redemption, a return. Instead, he found that the world had rearranged itself without him, and that people, especially women, had learned to build walled gardens with thick roots and be very particular about who they let through. The story's pulse broadened into the past in small, jagged flashes. There had been a son, a child who had almost been their son. Nin's belly had rounded with a secret happiness she had once believed would tether him. The son was gone now, a miscarriage the year she found the messages on his phone. She had closed herself in the bathroom and pressed her fingers to the place between her ribs until the world blurred and the decision to fall apart came like the tide. He had not stayed. He had left the city the week after the funeral. He had demanded she stage for the child, the way some people demanded memorials to their vanity. Shinjawi's face would appear frequently in flash, tacked with the glamour of a woman who knew how to wear other people's adoration like armor. She had been young, hungry, practiced in the art of smiling at men whose attention could buy her an apartment. When Lynch had chosen her, it had felt for a while like a wound that refused to stop pouring. Yet time is an economist and a moralist. Debts morph, and sometimes the cost of small cruelties compounds into ruin. Shinjawi had climbed quickly, then stumbled. Her alliances with powerful men were transactional and shallow. When her husband's fortunes waned, she found herself adrift, her smile less effective at opening doors. Rumors circulated that she had pushed for the embezzlement of a subsidiary company, that she had bribed an official with documents forged in the gray hours. The police investigation that followed did not favor her. The prosecution found ledgers and receipts that did not add up, wired transfers traced to shadow accounts. The narrative of a queen snared by her own crown moved fast. Lynch watched her falter with a mixture of superiority and something like regret for wasted time. He had not expected her to fall. He had expected her to carry him to new heights. When she imploded publicly, it left a smudge of shame on every person who had once pretended to admire her. For Nin, justice came in quieter forms. At the corporate hearings where the board of her old employer brought forward evidence of embezzlement, Nin testified with the calm of someone who had been hollowed out and refilled with care. She brought paper trails and emails and a confession letter from an ex-accountant who had decided the weight of complicity was too heavy to bear. The law moved in its slow, deliberate pace. Arrests were made, and faces that used to wear confidence now wore handcuffs, and the sudden pale of people who had spent decades constructing cunning and forgot to build exits. Nin watched with a particular interest when Lynch's name surfaced again, not as a defendant, but as a reluctant witness. He had been named in a list of contacts, an intermediary who had occasionally signed transfers under an alias. He claimed ignorance, and the lawyers of the prosecution raised an eyebrow. Ignorance is a poor defense when paper trails trace you like a shadow. The town of rumors narrowed to a line in the press about custody. Lynchen wanted visitation rights, citing the child he had never known, and arguing that abandoning a marriage does not undo paternal responsibility. The law acknowledged this with a procedural shrug. What bothered the court was not a romantic wrong, but the welfare of a child who did not exist. The judge, a woman with silver hair and a way of saying the word enough without raising her voice, dismissed the petition. Lynchen left the courthouse with his face hollowed, as if the city had carved out something essential and given it to him back in a currency he had never learned to use. Pezzi, meanwhile, was a man of regulated gestures. He had been a rival to many, a corporate presence with a reputation for absorbing businesses with slow, sure kindness. He had not sought Nin's marriage as a conquest. He had sought her as one finds a rare book that you know how to preserve. In private, he told her stories of the companies he had saved, not to boast, but to show her the architecture of stability. He liked how she read spreadsheets like poetry. He admired the way she returned to the porridge bowl on quiet mornings, the way she tasted something human in the simplest food. When they married in that glittering hall, many assumed it was a transaction, a CEO marrying an ambitious founder. The truth was seamier and kinder. Pezzi had been present on lonely nights when Nin had called, when the panic rose like acid in her throat. He sat with her in a therapy room and did not offer platitudes. He sat with her in hospital corridors where she had to revisit losses too heavy for a single night. He signed contracts that made sure her employees would not be abandoned when corporate sharks circled. He learned the small domestic rituals, how Nin liked her tea, the way her hands moved when she was anxious, and let them become his homework. After the wedding, the city hummed a new rumor. Lynchen regretted it. Not that he regretted leaving Nin, the press insisted, but that he regretted the consequences. His face, once puffy with the wine of easy choices, thinned. He tried to place himself into circles that had once been his, but, standing beside men who had traded in influence and now moved only in circles that excluded him, made him feel like a man with worn shoes who had come to the wrong party. He attempted one public redemption, an interview to reclaim his name. He rehearsed lines about learning, about being younger and foolish, about misunderstanding himself. The interview aired on a small network. The anchor asked the obvious questions and left the sharp ones to simmer. When it ended, the viewers' comments trickled in, then gushed. Too little, too late. Who does he think he is? Let him rot. Still, among the bile were a few voices that said, simply, people change. Nin read the excerpts and felt a small, steady pity. Pity sharpened by memory, but not corrupted by it. There were darker hours. A former friend of Nin's leaked an old text from Lynchen to a tabloid. A message begging for forgiveness sent the night he left to the woman he had chosen over her. The text had been drafted and deleted and then recovered by someone with time and a grudge. The tabloids ran with the scent of betrayal reheated. Nin resisted the urge to respond publicly. She had learned that some prizes are won in silence. Lynchen stood near the grand staircase, hands in his pockets, shoulders back, as if asking the crowd to remember he had once been part of it. He approached with that awful intensity men wear when trying to make a story about themselves. "You look good," he said to Nin. It was not meant as a compliment. It was an attempt to measure whether the life he had deserted had matured into something he could still step into. "Thank you," she said. "I do, don't I?" Her smile was a practiced blade, polite, sharp, and not meant for his benefit. Pesci watched from 5 yards away, a quiet presence. He did not step in front of Nin as if to block her. He simply remained, an unspoken boundary. "Do you regret it?" Lynchen asked then, the question that was really for himself. He wanted to know whether the world had judged him and condemned him, whether his past choices had calcified into an immovable verdict. Nin considered the question carefully. Regret, she supposed, was a private thing. It could be personal, surgical, the kind that removes the rot and leaves you smaller and wiser. Or it could be public, performative, the sort that seeks atonement by spectacle. She thought of the nights she had lain awake, the grief, the therapy sessions, the porridge bowls, the way Pesci looked at her. She thought of the people she had learned to protect and how their safety had to matter as much as her own feeling of being right. "Regret is a lonely word," she said finally. "It implies one person alone with their memory. What matters to me is repair." She turned, and Pesci's fingers found hers, warm and sure. Lynchen's face tightened as if she had struck him. He left soon after, a small, defeated figure deciding to disintegrate into the city's anonymous crowds. What followed was not melodrama, but consequence. The old friends who had once enabled Lynchen's departures fell away. His attempts to buy favors were met with the cold arithmetic of people who had learned to value reputation over history. He reached out to Shinjawi, who received him with the frosted politeness of someone who had been burned. She had married well, it was said, but Pesci had not been the man she chose. She had chosen someone else, or perhaps she had ended up alone. Rumors proliferated, half true and poisonous. Regardless, the woman who had once been the bright target of Lynchen's admiration had become a cautionary anecdote. He had left a life that could have anchored him and found only the precarious edge of a life built on borrowed light. Nin's company continued to grow. The nonprofit she funded opened its doors to women who needed legal aid and therapy. The clinic she supported created a small wing for those dealing with suicidal ideation and postpartum loss. Nin visited once and sat with a woman who had a child that would not stop crying, and watched the woman breathe through the panic. She held no speeches then, only a small human presence that said, "I see you." The arc of justice in their little world was not a single act, but a series of small, resilient adjustments. Arrests, resignations, settlements, quiet reimbursements. It did not erase the past, nor did it make Nin oblivious to pain. She kept the ring on her finger, but sometimes at night she would slip it off to feel its coolness and remember that even cherished metal cannot temper the ache entirely. Years later, Lynchen would sit at a small cafe with a paper cup and a rent-controlled phone, and realize that regret did not translate easily into policy. He had wanted the woman who had hardened herself into a leader. He had wanted status. He had wanted the quick fix. He had found in the public arena that those wants had consequences that refused to be quietly repented away. On a rainy evening, as Nin and Pesci hosted a small foundation dinner for survivors, a news alert blinked across screens. A former executive was indicted for fraud. A small, corrupt network dismantled. People clapped politely. Nin raised her glass, and Pesci's eyes found hers with the kind of look that said he would go to the ends of his resources for her cause. It was not perfect. Nin remembered the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The spaces between still raw, but filled with other people's laughter, aware of an imperfect, stubborn redemption. Linshan watched the footage on his own, alone. There was no one to comment, no one to comfort. He tapped the screen and sent a message. "I'm sorry." It sat in her inbox, unopened, polite and empty, a small digital relic of a man eager for absolution without having done the work. In the end, the city told its own story. Those who build with exploitation topple. Those who rebuild with care fortify. Nin's life did not become a fairy tale. It became instead a ledger of small, brave entries. Lines of protection, handshakes that saved jobs, therapy sessions paid for, a nursery she would one day create when the future, softened and cautious, allowed for the idea of a child. And Linshan, he who had abandoned a wife for a bright collar of promises, learned the most bitter lesson of all. Some doors, once closed in response to a betrayal, do not admit the climber back. Regret is useful only insofar as it changes the man who feels it. He had begun to change too late. The wedding footage replayed in headlines, a tableau now more complex than anyone had expected. A wronged woman who rose to power, an ex-husband who found himself regretting a choice, a new husband steady like an oak. For those who loved melodrama, it was a delicious reversal. For Nin, it was not about triumph so much as stewardship, holding the small, damaged people in her life and telling them, without fanfare, that they would not have to survive alone. Outside the rooftop garden, the city kept its lights like a distant jury. Inside, Nin and Pessy walked between guests and sat with survivors and lawyers. Amélia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "Twin guests and sat with survivors and lawyers." Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. At midnight, after the room had emptied and the staff had gone home, Nin stood with her hand around a cup of tea. She thought of porridge steam curling like a white flag, of hands that had once struck and hands that now held. She was not untouched by pain, but the pain had been filed into something that made space for others. A notification blinked. Linshan had sent another message. Nin opened it, read 3 words, "I regret everything," and closed the phone. She put the device in a drawer. Some confessions, she had learned, were best left to the lonely and the penitent. Behind the polished panels of the skyscraper, the city murmured. Lives kept moving. Men learned slowly that regret was a poor currency without reparation. Women like Nin collected evidence and built laws, not revenge. And when lightning struck the old way of doing things, embezzlement uncovered, arrests made, the world tilted toward a small, irreplaceable kind of justice. Accountability, repair, and the promise that those who had been abandoned could still be architects of their return. Outside, the rain slowed to a patient drizzle. Nin wrapped a scarf around her neck, caught Pessy's hand, and together they walked down into the light of a city that refused to stay small. They descended the stairwell in a slow, unhurried silence, the city's hum folding itself around them like a familiar coat. Pessy kept his hand in Nin's until the marble lobby gave way to the concrete street. At the curb, a cab idled. rain freckling its roof. They did not hurry. Both had learned that haste invited mistakes. The weeks that followed were a pattern of small, stubborn things. Meetings that began at dawn and ended past midnight. Funders who asked for glossy numbers and felt uncomfortable when she insisted on survivors' testimonies. Volunteers who arrived raw and stayed because someone had shown them dignity for the first time in years. There were legal drafts and press statements and a trustee meeting where Nin's temper flickered only once, like a match caught and snuffed, and then steadied again under the more familiar light of strategy. Nin's office was modest by the standards of the skyscraper that housed it. An external window that looked onto the street. A second-hand desk that had been repaired with an almost tender patience. A shelf of books whose spines were threaded with coffee stains. There was a small plant on the sill that Pesci tended dutifully. He called it stubborn, as if it were a person, and, occasionally, as if the plant were a confession. The foundation's name, chosen with deliberate plainness, was stamped on their letterhead. It read like a promise. People arrived in stages. Some were survivors who had found ways to be useful, teaching, cooking, filing. Some were lawyers who took no fee but asked for the truth, an honesty that pulsed through their work like a compass needle. There were social workers who sat in a ring and said little at first, and then said everything. A nurse volunteered on weekends. There were evenings when Nin would stand at the sink in the small kitchen and watch the steam from the kettle twirl and think of how many nights she had spent with an earlier man who refused to be small. Those nights tasted of a memory she no longer wanted to romanticize. The nursery became the foundation's most visible thing. Renting an old storefront with a boarded-up facade, the team painted it with colors that felt like a compass recalibrating. Soft blues and greens, a mustard that was warm but not cloying. Children's drawings lined the corridor, each one a deliberate claim on the future. Houses without locks, shoes that fit, faces that were allowed to be smiling without consequence. The first week they opened the doors, 2 mothers came in holding infants that smelled like milk and city smog, eyes ringed with fatigue. Nin knelt on the floor then, hands wrapped around a tiny head, and learned again to be small and patient in a way that was not weakness but a new kind of strength. Funding arrived in fits and starts. A philanthropic trust pledged a large, conditional grant. 3 years of seed money if the foundation met certain measurable outcomes. There were afternoons of Excel sheets and projections, then evenings of phone calls with donors who wanted success stories to print on their brochures. Nin learned to speak in 2 languages at once, the human and the fiscal. Pesci sat beside her as she prepared for one such meeting, his thumb finding the seam of her hand when she drifted into the pragmatic center of her mind. "You'll say the things they need to hear," he told her one night, "but only the truth." She laughed, a small, surprised sound. "That's all I have." There were losses, too. A grant reviewer questioned whether the foundation could sustainably support the kind of intensive therapy they insisted on. A politician, whose name was notorious for its elastic morality, suggested, in a smile that was all calculation, that funding could flow if Nin would attend a luncheon. The offer came with a thin paper of implication, nod and smiles in exchange for hands in pockets. Nin's boundary had become famous in a small, catastrophic way. She declined. The politician sent another message, this time thinly veiled. Principles are admirable when they are not expensive. Nin understood that the refusal would have consequences. She had already accepted them. Her board asked if she would relent, if a small compromise now would secure wide gains later. She did not speak in absolutes. She spoke in the currency she had acquired through years of seeing how compromise calcified into corruption. "We do not trade the people we protect for expediency," she said. The room was quiet. No one rose to argue. Lynch's name remained an awkward punctuation in the Foundation's public life. He offered testimony that was honest and, at points, painfully thin. Admissions of desire, of cowardice, of choices made. He spoke about the way power had once felt like warmth and had turned into a furnace that burned everyone around him. Some called his statements performative. Others said they read like someone who had finally become accountable. The courts demanded numbers and receipts. He provided what he could. He refused, in time, to speak in public about motivations that would distract from the harm he'd done. There is a blunt economy to remake. It requires punishments recorded and reparations tangible. Lynch wrote checks that surprised him by their smallness. Money felt different when given without expectation of praise. He gave interviews to investigators. He named names. The people who had been his co-conspirators retaliated with legal maneuvers that leaned on old influence. Someone leaked a photograph of Nin at a gala with a donor whose own history was, at best, ambiguous. The leak was designed to shame her into silence. Instead, it prompted a public conversation about the ways that proximity to capital could be weaponized. Nin, in a short statement, refused to be mercenary. She explained how they vetted donations and how they turned down money that compromised their core commitments. PC was a quiet force in all of this. He came from a lineage that had taught endurance as a craft. He was not given to oratory, but his interventions were of the kind that steady bridges in tremor. He negotiated with fund managers and watched the children in the nursery as if each one were an unread map he had been asked to keep safe. There were nights he spent helping with grant language, hands that could fold the coldness of bureaucratic phrases into sentences that still held human faces. He had his own adjustments. Friends from his former life, industrial contractors and old colleagues, still asked him, sometimes obliquely, how marriage had become a public strategy. He said nothing of the old life that had once been his, only that duty now belonged to something other than selfish success. Their private rituals remained small. PC prepared a soup that had no recipe and was always the right temperature. They would sit on the sofa and watch the news or a documentary about a place far worse than the city they knew, sometimes to remind themselves that their work had limits, but never to suffer complacency. At night, Nin sometimes dreamed of stairs, descending and ascending in equal measures, and woke with the taste of a salt she could not name. The pressure came in the end from an unexpected vector. A rival nonprofit, whose founder had once been an ally and a man Nin had trusted in a specific, private way, leaked internal documents that suggested the foundation's legal strategy was a little too aggressive, that the pursuit of accountability had drifted into something that felt punitive. There were op-eds that suggested the survivors' voices were being instrumentalized for publicity. Commentators who would never meet the women involved but felt urgent about the ethics of storytelling. For a week, the Foundation's inbox filled with questions. The board convened a session that lasted the better part of 2 days. Nin listened to the accusations, some of which were well-founded, others that were brittle attempts to dislodge them. She did not defend the Foundation with rhetorical flourish. She defended it with work and with transparent process. They opened their files to an independent auditor. They published a protocol. Nin called each survivor who had been named, not because they had to, but because she wanted them to be the first to hear and correct and, if necessary, leave. The moment that felt like rupture arrived in a simpler way. A donor threatened to withdraw if controversy continued. Controversy in these rooms translated in 2 ways: risk to image and risk to money. The donor's letter was careful, written in a language that was polite and deranged in its mercilessness. They wanted assurances of an end to litigious pursuits. The foundation faced a choice that felt, for the first time since its inception, like a test of whether their values could persist when the calendar read danger. They scheduled an emergency meeting. At the table sat the board, a legal counsel who had worked pro bono for years, and two survivors who had insisted on being present. The survivors spoke in a language that was simple and sharp. One of them, a woman with a cough that occasionally surprised her with its pain, said, "We did not come here so you could be safe." Nin's jaw tightened for a moment, but she did not speak from the place where she had power in the political sense. She spoke instead as a steward of trust. "We do not trade protection for funding," she said, "but we cannot survive on principle alone. If we collapse, the shelters close, and the mothers are back on the pavement." Pacey watched her. He had learned to read the micro-movements in her face that preceded compromise. He understood the calculus. The moral heart had to be kept beating, but the body needed air. "We find another donor," he suggested. "We scale in a way that is sustainable. We keep the litigation when it protects people, and we step back when it's performative." There is a reflex in civic repair to think of the rightness of a decision as separate from strategy. Nin had always refused that dichotomy. She changed their approach. They issued clearer guidelines about when to pursue legal action. They invested in alternative programming that made their outcomes measurable without weaponizing pain. And they launched a small pilot that connected survivors with job placements through partners who had pledged to remove barriers for them. The donor's withdrawal was painful but not fatal.
Pezzi stood near the sidewalk, watching the crowd scatter into smaller conversation clusters. He had become comfortable in the margins of photo frames. When he looked at Nin, there was not only love in his eyes, but the steady gaze of someone who knew the cost of being both tender and unyielding. The opening of the expanded wing, a tiny cluster of rooms dedicated to vocational training and legal aid, was quieter. There were no cameras. The projector that would run orientation videos had arrived late. Volunteers painted one last mural on a wall that was already graffitied with careful promises. A tree whose branches were both protective and reaching. At workstations, women learned bookkeeping and small digital skills that, for some of them, meant no longer fearing their own names on a payroll. The night the wing opened, Lin Chan stood across the street. He had no right to be there, but he told himself that looking from a distance was not an intrusion. He watched as people streamed into the new rooms, parents carrying babies, a man with a cane who volunteered for legal intake, a teenager who had once been in a shelter and now taught basic literacy classes. He stayed until the doors closed, and then walked away with a weight in his chest that felt like an answer to a question he had not known how to ask. There were moments that felt irrevocable for everyone. In a deposition that winter, a man who had once been at the center of the corrupt network pled guilty. His sentence was measured by the law, but the larger result was that many of the small players who had been exploited were named and, in some cases, given restitution. The prosecutors thanked Nin and the team for their rigor. Survivors sometimes thanked her directly, some with tears, some with pragmatic notes about courses and childcare. Nin received gratitude like a litany. She pocketed it and measured it against the lives she had not been able to save. The ring, when she took it off now, had become a small object of memory. She had moved it from the drawer into a box where she kept things that mattered but were no longer in circulation. A receipt for a therapy session that marked the first time a survivor had been able to name an abuser. A child's crayon drawing of a house with lights. On the night her second anniversary with Pezzi approached, he unfolded an old photograph he had found in a box at a charity shop. An image of two people on a ferry, smiling at one another in a way that neither of them looked particularly heroic. Pezzi slid it into a frame and left it on the shelf without comment. Nin's life, in the small logistics of domestic habit, had attained something like peace. It was not the naive peace of absence. It was a peace that had edges. She still wakes sometimes with the memory of hands that had once shaped her into anger. She still feels the phantom ache when a headline praised a simple villain as if any human being could be a mere plot point.
But she had built a house that held others. She had constructed an architecture of care that, even when threatened, refused to fold without a fight. Then, in a way that surfaced quietly at first, another threat came. A coalition of businesses concerned about the city's tightening regulations and the slow erosion of profit margins due to new transparency laws began to lobby local officials. They argued for less oversight and a loosening of the accountability frameworks that had led to the earlier arrests. The coalition's spokespeople used the language of efficiency and the need to free commerce. Nin read their op-eds with a slow, rising frustration. The phrasing was familiar, economic inevitability used to obscure moral choice. This time, the opposition was not merely about money. It was about the political ground that allowed malpractice to reassert itself. If oversight loosened, the cycle that had once chewed through lives could begin again, albeit with new faces. A meeting was called by a city council member who had become a reluctant ally of the foundation. They convened a forum to discuss policy, transparency in funding, tighter fiduciary safeguards, a registry for philanthropic gifts connected to corporate actors with histories of exploitation. Nin marshaled testimony. She prepared case studies with legal counsel. She asked survivors if they wished to speak. Some did. One woman, who had learned to navigate the city's labyrinths and now worked in an accounts payable office, stood and told the room about the nights when she had held a child and wondered if anyone would ever demand that institutions pay the price of the harm they had caused. "We need laws," she said, "because promises break." The room listened as if the statement were new. It was not new. It was necessary. Luncheon attended the forum. He sat near the back and listened. The city felt larger and smaller at once. Large because the stakes were systemic. Small because everyone present had friends or labors that connected them directly to the outcomes. After the forum, a reporter found Luncheon and asked if he wished to comment. He declined. Then the reporter asked if he would meet with one of the survivors to explain as best he could the structures that allowed him to stray. He agreed. Their meeting was neither cinematic nor tidy. They sat across a narrow cafe table. The survivor's expression was guarded but not unfriendly. Luncheon spoke in a new register. He offered technical explanations of financial failings, admissions of personal moral collapse, and the simplest of things, an apology that required no expectation of being heard. She listened. She asked questions about restitution. He answered with a willingness to testify, to disclose, and to help build the legal scaffolding that could close the loopholes. It was, perhaps, the most useful thing he had done in the city since his exile. He understood, with the slow cruelty of experience, that words were inadequate. One afternoon,
As the light slanted gold over the nursery's courtyard, a little boy clung to Nin's leg and would not let go. He had scraped his knee and was brave in the way children are, undaunted, immediate. Nin sat on the steps and helped him clean it. He looked up at her with a seriousness that made her heart ache and swell at once. "When I'm big," he said, in a voice that contained a small certainty, "I'll make sure nobody hurts anyone." She smiled and adjusted the bandage. "Good," she said. "We'll teach you how." He considered this. "And when you're old, will you be my grandma?" he asked. The question was an impulse. Children speak without asking for permission. Nin felt something like an ache that was not the old wound, but a tenderness she had not anticipated. She did not answer in the language of permanency. "I'll be someone who remembers you," she said. It was the truest thing she could offer. Across the courtyard, Lynchen watched from a distance again, this time because he had business in the building, testifying about audit protocols, and the scene caught him off guard. He saw the boy snug against Nin's knee, the small bandage a badge of care. For a long while he simply watched. He allowed himself a single thought that was not wrapped in shame but in simple hope, that some work, once begun, continued with or without him, and could, perhaps, even outlast his failures. As evening fell, the city settled into its ordinary constellation of demands and delights. Nin turned the nursery's lock, checked the calendar for tomorrow's training, and shelved a few stray toys. Pessie made tea. Outside, the street lamps blinked awake. In the small quiet of their apartment, Nin put her hand into the drawer where the ring had once lived, and found instead the box of small relics. She touched the edge of the paper receipt and then slid the box closed. She did not imagine a life without memory. She had learned that memory was necessary ballast. She also did not live for the spectacle of pity or triumph. Her life had become, finally, the honest simplicity of a promise kept, to stand with others, to protect, to repair where possible, and to refuse the complacency that once allowed harm to multiply. From the window they watched a tram pass, a line of light on the street. Nin rested her head on Pessie's shoulder and let the city be at once louder and more intimate than the days of her youth. There was work to be done tomorrow, and promises to steward, and, somewhere else, a man who had begun to make amends in ways that might, in time, matter. She did not know if any of it would be enough. She only knew, with a clarity that had cost her dearly, that she would keep building the small things that held people safe, nurseries, laws, shelters, oral histories, until the architecture of the city no longer permitted the old abuses to root themselves. Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, insistently ordinary.
Então, gar a child hummed in the next room, e Pessie left at a line in a book. Nin closed her eyes for a moment. He felt, in the particular quiet that follows care well given, that the city had shifted its weight toward something that would allow more people to breathe. The light in the nursery window blinked, a small human constellation against the dark, refusing to ser pequeñ.